Hi, everybody. Good morning. This is Lee Howard from Diana T. Myers and Associates. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm excited to introduce this morning Maria Williams from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We being the Eastern and Western Pennsylvania Continuums of Care, have sort of formally partnered with PCADV this year towards the COC's application for domestic violence bonus funding. And this is sort of, I think, been a very long time coming. Domestic violence providers have been essential members of the COC for years and years and years, and this is sort of taking that relationship and partnership to the next level with a formal partnership between the Continuums of Care and the State Domestic Violence Coalition. For those of you who don't know, the East and West COCs are both submitting very large domestic violence rapid rehousing projects under this year's HUD COC NOFA, and look forward to good things and lots of units coming from those two new project applications. In addition to that, one of the expectations of HUD, and something that we believe is just best practice, is for non-DV providers to have the opportunity to understand how to best serve DV providers, DV survivors in their programs. And so that's what today's webinar is really going to focus on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria.
Thanks, Lee. Like Lee said, my name is Maria Williams, and I'm the housing specialist here at PCADV. My position is very new. I just started at the end of June. And so everyone on this call knows far more about Pennsylvania than I do. So if you have any tips you'd like to share, please let me know. But what I'm hoping that I can do is help with the general understanding and knowledge of how to serve survivors of domestic violence in your program. I think historically in the housing and homeless community, there's been the idea that you have a survivor walk through your door, and the only thing that can happen is that you turn them over to a domestic violence program and everybody hopes for the best. What we know, though, is that's not reality. And what I want to help you do today is really identify the places that, as a homeless housing provider that maybe doesn't specialize in domestic violence or doesn't even have what you feel is a comfortable understanding of domestic violence, that you can have a few tools that can either get you to a phone call to me or to your local provider, and I'll show you how to connect with your local provider, so you can really work with the people that are living in your program or that are seeking services from your program. So today I'm hoping that we'll talk about sort of the connection of domestic violence and homelessness, give you some tools about recognizing and responding to domestic violence, and then we'll talk a little bit about domestic violence advocacy. Counseling is often what it's called here in Pennsylvania. We'll talk about a few scenarios, too, that over the years that I've done this work that have come up from colleagues of mine in homeless housing. But what I'd also love is if in the chat, if you have scenarios that you want to talk about today, I would love to do that, because I know I've done this for many years, and I know that in the homeless housing world, there's always the things that come up that you have no idea what to do, and rather than feeling like you ought to know, the best thing to do is just bring that out into the light, and we can all talk about it together so you know you're not alone in this. So domestic violence is a pattern of coercive power and control. Domestic violence is often shown as a cycle of abuse, and there are organizations that use that cycle, and there are organizations that don't. But the most important thing that you can really note in a relationship where domestic violence is existing is that there's a pattern of power and control. There's a big difference between bad behavior and domestic violence. One can often be the other, but sometimes what we see is a couple who had an explosive moment and maybe they don't have a healthy relationship, and that's a whole nother conversation. Then what we see is the belittling of one person in the relationship to build the other. I had a colleague of mine once say that domestic violence equates the survivor to nothing more than a chair that you would sit on. I think that you really can pull out the dynamics of domestic violence when you look at who is thriving in a relationship and who is surviving. So an abusive partner's behavior often affects the survivor's choices and behavior, and even whether or not she or he can increase her own safety and ability to cope. And survivors have real fears. They often, we think that if we stop the physical violence or separate people, that's where that will end. But with technology and all sorts of other ways that abusive partners use control over survivors, that is often not where it ends. And then when you're working with a couple in particular, it can often seem difficult to identify who is the victim and who is the abuser. And those are things that we can talk out in individual situations, but also know that, you will oftentimes have to really dig and try to figure that out and ask the right questions, and we'll talk about that as we go. So Ann Menard is the CEO of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence based here in Harrisburg, and what she points out is that domestic violence shelter has been the sort of historic response to survivors' need of housing and need to leave an abusive situation. But what we know and what you all know is once a person becomes homeless, they're far more likely to become homeless again. So we're seeing real benefits in helping survivors obtain or maintain permanent and stable housing. The domestic violence community is new to that work. Most domestic violence organizations don't have extensive permanent housing programs. So this is another important reason that housing homeless providers understand how to serve survivors and understand that survivors are in your program and that those needs are going to be different than a lot of other folks in your program, because there just is not enough space in emergency shelter. We know that emergency shelter is often reserved for the folks that need it the most, and that can eliminate a whole other group of survivors that are also in need of housing and in need of safe housing, but could more easily move into permanent. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children in the United States, and it is the most common occurrence that survivors will lose their housing in the things that they need to do to escape the violence that they're experiencing. There's also a long history of eviction due to partners' behaviors. Domestic violence can often interfere with even the ability to access housing. Abusive partners can ruin a survivor's credit. They can lead to a survivor having poor rental histories or not having any rental history at all because they weren't allowed to have their name on a lease. And it can often increase the safety needs of housing in that they may not be able to just move into a place next door. They need to get more creative about what will work for them. And the underlying current of all of this is the sabotage of economic stability. So if you can't pay for your housing, you obviously can't obtain or maintain housing easily. And that's a tool that abusive partners will use to keep survivors with them. And homelessness is only one part of the housing problems that survivors can face. Because of abuse, there's often missed or late rent payments, and it can get confusing because sometimes those missed payments will happen because of the domestic violence that's occurring, but sometimes those missed rent payments happen because of all the other things that families and individuals that we all work with experience, and that's generational poverty, that's loss of a job, that's unexpected costs that come up, and when you have no savings and when you have no economic safety net, it's easy to miss those payments. What gets more complicated for survivors, though, is that there's often, well, there is always an underlying current of control that's occurring. They may not have control of the money in the household anyway, and so when an unexpected need comes up that has to be paid for, rather than having a discussion in the home about how the money is going to be prioritized, the abusive partner just chooses that. So that can lead to survivors having incredible credit card debt, problems with landlords, evictions, and all sorts of other things on a record that could prevent them from being housed. Some families also face barriers to using emergency shelters. Emergency shelters are most often communal or semi-communal, even in domestic violence emergency shelters. And while that can work for some folks, what we know is that dignity and autonomy are two of the most important things that can occur for a survivor when she or he leaves an abusive situation. And oftentimes going to live with a whole other bunch of adults that you don't know that are dealing with a whole lot of problems that you don't want to make your own can be a pretty undignified experience and something that can recreate traumatic situations that they had left. And we also know that in the community as a whole, a disproportionate number of people of color are homeless. This also exists for survivors. So not only are they facing all of the systemic barriers that come along with domestic violence, they're also facing all the systemic barriers that come along with being a person of color. So as we were saying before, domestic violence survivors will access your programs, and oftentimes DV shelters lack capacity due to the things that we had already talked about, and there's a real prioritization of the danger of domestic violence over the danger of living on the street. And this is one of the most common places where mainstream housing programs and domestic violence housing programs sort of split, that DV will prioritize the danger that has been occurring, that has been coercive, that has been a pattern, where homeless programs will prioritize folks living on the street and the dangers. And one is not greater than the other, but this is where it's really important that our fields work together. From a national study, half the survivors who identify a need for housing services upon fleeing abusive homes don't receive them. From beginning to look at data here in Pennsylvania, I'm not sure that that's true here. I think that there is more capacity in some areas, particularly the balance of state COCs, to serve survivors in emergency shelter. But I think what I want to question is whether or not that's the best use of resource. And if we're thinking as the balance of state COCs about how we want to use resources and how we want to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our system are avoiding homelessness altogether, is emergency shelter the best response? If a housing option isn't provided for a survivor, most often they'll return to an abusive partner, or they'll end up dealing with chronic homelessness. So our next section is about recognizing and responding to domestic violence, but I'm wondering if there are any questions at this point.
I haven't seen any questions so far, Maria.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it's important when an individual comes into your program that you don't have context for, that asking about domestic violence is part of the process. Some survivors that will be the thing that they lead with, and that will be the first thing that is coming up for them, and the thing that they often feel the most comfortable talking about, rather than talking about the economic issues they're facing or the episodes of homelessness prior to this instance. They'll want to identify as a survivor, and at that point, that oftentimes makes it easier for a housing homeless provider to then dig in with that person because they're willing to identify. Or a domestic violence agency has referred an individual to you. Even in that case, I would let the person identify themselves as a survivor rather than just jumping in and wanting to talk to them about the domestic violence that they've experienced. I think that survivors really deserve all of the autonomy and space in the world to identify as they need or want to identify. And with some people, they may feel very comfortable identifying as a survivor. With others, they may not, and that may take time. And respecting that process is really important. So if you don't know, though, if the individual or family you're working with is surviving domestic violence, the welcome and intake protocol really should include the asking about domestic violence in a safe, respectful, and universal way. And what I mean by that is that I have worked with programs in the past, and like I say, I don't know that this happens here in Pennsylvania, but that it was a low-income housing program, and a couple came into the program, and the case manager was really concerned that domestic violence was going on, and so during the intake, because of how the couple was communicating with each other, so during the intake, while both members of the couple were sitting there, the case manager said, "I'm really concerned about the way you're speaking to each other," and then turned to the female partner in the relationship and said, "Are you experiencing domestic violence?" As you can imagine, that did not go over well. The couple ended up leaving, and it was one of those moments that, you know, if you could go back and if you could make different decisions, one of the most, I think, valuable things that case managers have is this ability to really look into what is actually going on for a person underneath the things that they are saying is happening for them. And to bring up those matters takes time. There's a difference between you seeing, you know, an instance of a physical safety violation that's deeply concerning to you and will be concerning to others in the program, and you having concerns about a way a couple is speaking to each other. And we'll talk about some ways that you can pull that apart. Some of the common pitfalls that housing homeless programs have made in the past, and again, I don't know that this happens here, but that a survivor will present and identify that she or he is in a significant amount of danger, and the homeless housing program will screen them out due to that danger. Or they'll unintentionally re-victimize and increase the danger by having policies in place that say that you need to get a protection from abuse order, or do some other things like that, like stop speaking to your abusive partner and all these sorts of things, because as I was saying before, the most important thing that you can offer a survivor when they're leaving is dignity and autonomy. Truthfully, I think that's probably the most important thing you can offer anyone that's coming into your programs, but one of the ways to quickly reduce that autonomy is by saying to a survivor, "I hear that you have identified to me as a survivor of domestic violence. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Here are the following 5 things that now have to happen." That doesn't work well for the survivor, obviously, and it also doesn't work well for the program or the case manager, because it can often then turn into an unintentional re-victimization. So the underlying theme here is the expert is really, or the survivor is really the expert in his or her own life. One of the things that I tell folks that work in domestic violence emergency shelter often is that the person that you're seeing has survived far longer than the time that they have known you. And I know that this is another common sort of way of thinking in the housing homelessness community too, that you know, people have had all sorts of ways of maintaining housing before they walked through our doors, so we're not the ones that are going to be able to tell them that this is absolutely what they need to do, because every situation is different, every person's reality is different. So one of the best ways that a provider can engage is by asking what has worked for someone in the past. And then it's also so helpful at that point, too, to ask a survivor if they would like to speak with the local domestic violence program. That can both support the domestic violence survivor exponentially, but can also support you as a housing homeless provider. I think that we often feel like we need to know all of the answers, and if we come across as not knowing the answers, that can really put like our reputation in jeopardy, or our jobs in jeopardy, or any of these things. But what is true is that the more that you can collaborate with other providers, the better. And particularly when you're talking about issues of domestic violence and safety, the more that you can bring in your local program, the better. All of that, though, needs to be contingent upon what the survivor wants. If the survivor says, I have worked with that program and I don't want to go back, or I'm happy talking to you, you're the first person that I've told, and I don't really want to speak to anybody else about that, it's your responsibility to support the survivor's wishes. But that doesn't mean that you can't then, as a provider, reach out to your local domestic violence program and say, hey, I can't tell you any details, but I had this situation occur and I just really need to debrief it. My contact information is also at the end of this slide, or end of this slide presentation, and I'm happy to be a person that you contact also to say, I don't have any idea what to do and I need somebody else to game plan this with me. I've done that now for years for homeless housing providers. I enjoy it very much. And it also helps us all understand what the scope of need really is in the balance of state COCs if we're communicating better with each other about the people that we're seeing and the things that we really need as providers to do the work. Oftentimes there can be, and I say this as a person who has been in the domestic violence field for a long time, a lot of sort of superiority that domestic violence advocates can bring into a situation, and believing that we know best and that we're experts and that no one else can tell a survivor what to do. And there's all sorts of problems with that, right? So it's important that then as we're collaborating as homeless housing providers and domestic violence advocates, so that we're truly collaborating rather than trying to compete with each other for, I know how to serve this victimized person better than you. As we talked about, there are some things you definitely want to avoid in asking about domestic violence, like the story I told asking about DV and an abusive partner's presence. Even if you're not sure that the partner is abusive, having those conversations with a couple is never the way to go. Also, I think that because of the fear around talking about domestic violence, that oftentimes providers will just give somebody a phone number to a domestic violence hotline and say, here, call this. What we know, though, is abusive partners can often find that information, and so it's important to ask a survivor independently, do you need a phone number? Do you need a hotline? I know someone at this domestic violence program. I think they'd be happy to talk to you, and find out how she or he would like to receive that information. On the more technical side, oftentimes damage is caused in units by domestic violence. That is never the person that's surviving the violence. It is never their fault. So being able to work with survivors who have damaged units to repair the unit and not charge nor blame the survivor for that damage is very important. It's also very important to know when you're helping a survivor either get housed or is being housed in your program that she or he cannot control whether or not her abusive partner shows up. I think I've talked to someone recently, excuse me, where there were some concerns about an abusive partner being on the property and the survivor being evicted from the property because of that. If a survivor is evicted from a property because his or her abuser is showing up, that will escalate danger almost faster than anything. So what's important in those situations is saying, is this place still working for you? If it is, how are we going to partner together, the case manager and the survivor, to make sure that the abusive partner doesn't come on the property? It's also important to really look at your eligibility criteria for your housing, and I know that Pennsylvania has really prioritized becoming are using Housing First philosophy, and so we're all hopefully working from a low barrier model. But it is essential for the safety of survivors that housing is easily accessed and there aren't a bunch of hoops to jump through. So pairing safe and stable housing with domestic violence information and know-how can be very, very powerful for survivors. As I was talking about before, DV can really interfere with your ability to access housing and to maintain housing, and survivors that can't maintain their housing are highly vulnerable to returning to the abusive situation or to be re-abused or re-victimized by another individual. I know that many of us have worked with survivors who seem to leave one abusive relationship for another, and that is very common. The thing that can really interrupt that, though, is if a survivor is both met with social service providers that are really willing to be understanding and thoughtful and compassionate with them, and with an offer of safe and stable housing options. Not just, this is the one thing I can do for you, but what is it that's going to work best for you, and how are we going to collaborate with other providers to make that happen? Excuse me. So specialized domestic violence-informed tailored services can really address the interacting factors and be the difference in a survivor's ability to truly embed safety in their lives. So it's really the pairing of great advocacy under case management with safe and stable housing options that can make a big difference. So having a domestic violence lens on your work is important, and what that means is that you are viewing interactions in your programs through the lens that the majority of the people that you are working with have probably either been a childhood survivor of domestic violence, an adult survivor of domestic violence, a survivor of rape, a survivor of incest, all of these things. We know that once you are sexually victimized, you are far more likely to become homeless, and oftentimes that occurs because of internalized oppression that happens from victimization and a whole bunch of other societal factors that figure into that. But what we know is the majority of homeless folks have been victimized in some way or another. So really walking into a situation assuming that you're dealing with some level of victimization is essential. So more than half of DV survivors live in households with children under 12. Almost 50% of school-age children and 30% of kids under 5 have witnessed domestic violence in their families, and exposure to significant violence, exposure to violence significantly impacts development, health, behavior, and there are all sorts of really harrowing studies that the CDC has done that look at how victimization early in life and traumas early in life really affect risk-taking behaviors later in life. And moving into your work with the idea that someone is addicted because of victimization that they've experienced is essential, and asking about that and figuring out how to dig in with people is very important. And for adults in the household, the need for a DV lens is essential because of an abuser's interference with the housing stability of a family. Survivors also experience discrimination based on the status as victims. In the new Violence Against Women Act, there's specific language that lines out support for survivors in public housing and other means of housing. It has been very common in the past that once an individual identifies themselves as a survivor or that information comes to a landlord or a potential landlord, they're either not given the unit or they're evicted based on all sorts of other things. VAWA has really come down strong in saying that survivors deserve to be protected in their housing. There's also high risk of violence in public housing and high density housing in general, and that may put women or folks that are gendered differently at continued risk, and it could also trigger trauma. And there's only so much we can do about that, right? But the important thing is that we're having conversations with folks that have identified as surviving violence, and really helping them figure out how they can best live in the situations that we have. And then even after a survivor is housed, that stability can be very triggering to an abuser, and oftentimes then the abusive partner begins stalking and harassing, and there's ongoing violence and threats even though they are stably housed. And so knowing that you may work in a permanent housing program, knowing that just because the survivor is permanently housed doesn't mean that they are safe, and that conversation needs to continue if the survivor is willing. So the next section is about domestic violence advocacy and counseling, and I wonder if there are any questions that have come up at this point.
Yes, there is one from Nikki, and she asks, I don't want to re-victimize, but we also need to somehow document that the client qualifies as Category 4. How can we document without asking for a PFA or police report?
So survivors, and if this is different in Pennsylvania, someone should stop me, probably Lee. It's my understanding that survivors can self-declare victimization, and that there are specific forms that can be developed that allow for that self-declaration. Let me do a little more research, but there's no, I know for a fact that there's no reason that a PFA or a police report is required to document Category 4, because Category 4 is fleeing or attempting to flee. Many individuals who are fleeing or attempting to flee don't have the ability to get a PFA, or sometimes getting a PFA or getting police involved will be far more dangerous. You can see that in instances of undocumented families in particular. So that's never something that we want to encourage, but self-declaration should work. I'm going to do a little bit of research, and then I'll get that information out to you all after the presentation.
And that's the only question that we have at this point.
Okay. So we're going to move on now to talk a little bit about domestic violence advocacy and counseling and our framework of services. And Lee has told me that you all have had trainings on trauma-informed care and strengths-based work, and I know that that's a huge component of Housing First work. So a lot of this will be review. I just want to make sure that oftentimes what really happens in domestic violence services seems very unclear to the rest of the world, and there's a lot of reason for that, that we obviously want to keep survivors protected, but under no circumstance do we want to keep the work that we're doing so secret that it seems like you all as housing homeless providers can't interact with it. So the cornerstone of what of how we practice is confidentiality. And as I was talking about VAWA prior, there are statutory requirements to protect survivor confidentiality. Pennsylvania, and particularly the balanced state COCs, are doing a really excellent job of protecting that confidentiality, particularly in the coordinated entry systems. I think that the rest of the country has a lot to learn from you all in regard to that. I'm excited to continue to support that great work if there's any way that I can. The best practice is to afford all survivors basic safeguards of confidentiality regardless of statute or funding. So a great example of this is with a release of information. You can only release the information that the survivor is allowing you to, and not anything more about their situation. You want to really think about, too, who you're sharing your paperwork with as a program, who you're sharing information with, where does personally identifying information go, how visible is that information to the public, and what are ways that you can make sure that survivor information is kept confidential. So the best thing to do is when you're unsure about how to share information or what information to share is to ask the survivor what works for them, what's okay to have out in the world, what's not, and then based on that, you follow policies and procedures of your own agency to keep information confidential. We know that there are lots of issues that can challenge stabilization in housing, and everything that domestic violence advocates do is through a lens of confidentiality, but it's also through a lens of trauma. And then we know that trauma impacts people in deep and profound ways, and that there are lots of ways that trauma can show up, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Ongoing legal issues, survivors are embroiled in the legal system, oftentimes for years, and that can be anything from custody to property ownership to immigration issues that will keep a survivor embroiled in that system. It's also a tactic that abusive partners use to continue to have control over what the survivor is or is not doing. One of the more dangerous things that can happen is that if you have an abusive partner who is prone to stalking, and this is one of the things that's terribly difficult to document, but what we know is that if there are many abusers that once a survivor has begun to stabilize and has begun to get his feet on the ground and is moving forward in ways that make sense for them, the abusive partner will leave and go on and find someone else to victimize, unfortunately. There are, though, what I believe from my years in the work is a small amount of abusive partners who refuse to leave a survivor alone. And in that, what we find is that all of the housing protections in the world that we can put in place are fantastic, but what those situations often boil down to is the need for relocation. One of the things that we've found in the movement, in the domestic violence movement, is the more access that survivors have to flexible funding and the idea that you have housing options rather than you can have this housing or this housing, but that if you need to leave, if leaving the area, if going to your mom's across the country or to a friend's in Texas or whatever is the best thing for you to do, then we believe you and we want to support you in that and we'll help you get there. The difference, too, then is about believing the survivor and believing that this is the best thing for them rather than this individual is going to, just to use the Texas example, going to move to Texas to live with their friends, and now we need proof of their permanent housing and we need proof that they're stabilized and all of these sorts of things. What we need to be doing is working with funders to really help them understand that, you know, not just survivors, but folks that are in our systems in general are the experts in their own lives, and that there's only so much that we can do to offer them safety and stability, and if they're saying that safety and stability is elsewhere, that we need to listen and respect that. Oftentimes survivors can have an interrupted or sabotaged employment history because because of abusive partners' ongoing stalking or refusal to let them leave the home, or due to injury or lack of sleep or a whole variety of other things, need to protect their children. Survivors often miss work, and that can be a huge barrier to maintaining housing. And then oftentimes survivors will end up with a criminal record. It's really important, I think, to know that survivors don't always end up with a criminal record because they're abusive partners. Sometimes survivors end up with a criminal record because they've made bad choices, or choices that we wouldn't make, or choices that have landed them in the criminal legal system, or they are suffering the impacts of systemic oppression that make it far easier for them to land in the criminal legal system than someone like myself, for example. So there are all sorts of reasons that criminal records can exist, but the important thing is to not say, well, this doesn't have to do with domestic violence, so I'm not addressing it. The important thing is to use the lens of domestic violence to view that criminal record and say, gosh, you know, you definitely should not have done X, Y, Z, but how has the trauma that you experienced impacted the fact that you then had to go to jail and you were victimized in jail? So talk about that and talk through that, because oftentimes the reason that people don't stay in permanent housing is they don't feel as though they can maintain it, that they don't deserve to be there. And so part of our work is to really dismantle those systems of internal oppression that exist to help survivors and folks that are dealing with housing instability in general believe that they really do deserve to be housed. Another issue that has come up quite frequently recently is not being able to move into housing with pets. I know myself, I have 2 dogs, and if someone had told me that I had to leave and I had to leave my dogs behind, I certainly would not do that because they are spoiled and I can't live without them. So many people feel that way, and to tell a survivor that she or he has to choose between leaving their pet behind and possibly having that pet harmed in some way, or coming into shelter, can create a huge barrier to service. I visited a couple of programs recently that have a whole pet shelter set up, running in conjunction with their emergency shelter. I think that's just fantastic. And I've also known programs that have developed relationships with the local humane society to keep pets on a temporary basis while a person is stabilizing and housing. So there are all sorts of things you can do that will really help survivors stabilize and thinking about all these little things that may be keeping them from truly stabilizing and housing. And again, keying in on trauma is really one of the most essential things you can do. Trauma is defined here is when the external threat overwhelms the coping resources. So for survivors, that's an ongoing state of being. So whether or not that threat is real or perceived doesn't matter. The fact is that they've lost their ability to cope because of the trauma that they've experienced. Some symptoms that we see from that are hypervigilance, people scanning for danger or reacting to a real or perceived threat in ways that we may not understand or seem like they're out of context or scope for what's actually happening. Many survivors suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, whether or not they are diagnosed. And the symptoms that from PTSD are seen as the behavioral manifestation of all of the changes that occur because of trauma. The responses are completely normal, but they interfere significantly with the survivor's ability to maintain patterns of behaviors in their life that allow them to maintain housing. And so in addition to all of the concrete things that occur, that people need assistance with economic stability, and people need assistance with food security and with medical advocacy and all of these other things, what we know survivors need also is help addressing their trauma. So I know that we have all worked with people that we've sat across from and have seen many of these things come up. I can think of one time when I was working with a survivor, and she was having a really hard time remembering what we were talking about. And that was particularly frustrating for me because I was working with her to secure permanent housing. And I was living in a major metropolitan area at the time, and Section 8 housing was few and far between, and she managed to get a voucher. And this was an incredible success for her and for her children. So all she needed to do was fill out some paperwork. And it was like I had asked her to move a mountain. Like it couldn't happen. So we had to really problem solve around what was going on and how we could best work together. What I ended up doing was she invited me to come to speak with her and her therapist and I helped her fill out paperwork together. I wasn't there for anything, any trauma processing or anything like that, but she felt more supported when it was someone that understood her trauma far better than I did, and she had done a ton of trauma processing with to sit and fill out this paperwork because it was just very triggering to her and she was really struggling with. I'm one of those people that, like, if there's a task to be done, I'm going to do it quickly. And so it was really challenging for me to sit with her and to be patient and to make sure that, like, I wasn't reacting to the fact that, like, she couldn't help how she was feeling, and that the situation and the system needed to shift for her rather than expecting her to adapt to the situation and the system. So trauma can be mistaken for apathy, poor self-worth, like we were talking about before, that many survivors don't believe that they deserve to be in permanent housing. Many believe they deserve to be homeless, that they've done something to make this happen to them in their lives, and that's part of the impact of domestic violence. They can, oftentimes survivors seem disinterested in getting help. I've worked with a lot of mainstream housing providers prior who have said, I know that there's domestic violence going on, and it seems like she just doesn't care. And the fact is that the person that's surviving violence obviously does care, but there's oftentimes very little that she or he feels that they can really do about that, or that they can really make a situation change. Because oftentimes folks that are surviving domestic violence in their adulthood also survived it as children. And so if this is an ongoing pattern, if it's all that you know, it's really hard to believe that something could be different. So how can your program help with safety? As we talked about before, having policies in place with your DV agency partner for emergent needs could be really important. So if you are in a community where there is a domestic violence provider, and there's one in every county in Pennsylvania, it would be great for you to reach out to them and to say, you know, when we're serving survivors, how would you like us to handle this? And how can we partner together and really develop something that will outlive whoever is currently working at those agencies and is interested in wanting to make that partnership, but really build it into your policies and procedures as an agency. That when you know, a survivor is living at your agency or living or receiving services from your agency, that if the survivor wants, the domestic violence advocate will be contacted, but if they don't want, here's what support from a peer-to-peer level looks like. Those sorts of things are essential. If there are other safe housing options in the community, referrals to those are fantastic, but really knowing that, like, the survivor may need to stay there, and how do you make that as safe as possible is essential. If you're working with a couple in a unit and it ends up that there is domestic violence occurring and that the abuser leaves the unit, although it can be challenging, it is very important to offer that abusive partner resources and housing. If we are living as a housing first community and we believe that housing is a human right and a basic right, even folks that are using abusive tactics deserve to be housed. And what we've seen too over time is that when abusive partners are more stable, they are far less likely to continue to victimize their partner, because all of this has to do with some sort of instability and internalized depression that both people are feeling. So if an abusive partner has access to resources, and I got to tell you, in all of the housing homeless providers that I have consulted with, I have had very few tell me stories about abusive partners wanting anything to do with them once the abusive partner has left, but making sure that that person doesn't feel completely without resources is important. And then there are all sorts of things that go into how much ongoing contact a survivor and abusive partner have to have with each other or may want to have with each other after a separation occurs. Everything from child custody to care of property to care of in-laws or elderly parents comes into play, just as it does in every relationship. And so even though that relationship was violent or has a pattern of violence, many times they still have to be in contact with each other. It is easy to judge, and domestic violence advocates are every bit as guilty of that judgment as anyone else. But it really boils down to the fact that we don't know what's going on for that survivor, and we don't need to know all the details. What we need to do is say, it seems like you're having a lot of contact with your abusive partner. How's that working for you? And if she or he says that it's great and here are the ways that it's benefiting from me, like, I think it's important to say, well, I'm concerned about you, and play that out with the survivor that you're working with. But most likely what she will say is, I have to have contact with them, and it's really upsetting to me, and I wish things could be different, and that really gives you the opportunity to support the individual. If you're concerned about immediate safety needs, as we've said before, the survivor is the expert in his or her own life, and so really listening to what the survivor would like and what they feel will meet their immediate safety needs is important, even if you feel like it is the thing that will not work. Again, I think that it's important as case managers to say, I hear that that's your idea and I want to support you. I got to tell you, it concerns me for the following reasons. And coming at it from a really human perspective rather than these are the policies and procedures that are in place and this is what I need to do if domestic violence is occurring, I think is essential. If you're also working with the abusive partner, it's important, again, to not have conversations about safety with the abusive partner present. I know that seems like a real no-duh sort of moment, but again, I have seen it happen, and so I always want to make sure that that's in the light for people. And then really leaning on the domestic violence agency in your community for partnership, again, either as a referral or for consultation, because you as a case manager and a homeless housing provider deserve support too. It's important to remember when you're thinking about safety planning with a survivor that it's a process, not a one-time event or checklist. I have worked with funders in the past who really want you to show a safety plan, and that's not what a safety plan is. A safety plan is sitting with a survivor and asking them what's going to work best for them in that moment, in that current context. So it's an ongoing conversation. It's tailored to the survivor's needs in life and daily activities, and every day is going to be different. So you can safety plan around situations. I can think of when shared custody of children is an issue, thinking about safety planning during the transfer of children is great and something that can sort of have a pattern around it. But if you're working with a survivor who is in school and his or her abusive partner also attends that college or that training program and they know, or they just know that they're there, that sort of safety planning is going to look different every day. And again, it's important to remember that you don't need to be the only person safety planning with the survivor, that you can lean on the domestic violence agency in your community to help you come up with ways to safety plan, even if the survivor doesn't want to work with the DV agency. in an ideal situation, the domestic violence advocate who is deeply trained in safety planning would be safety planning with the survivor, but we know that can't always be the reality. It's also important, as we've talked about, to understand the abusive partner's role, to really look at visitation. Did the abusive partner provide the majority of child care or transportation? And if that's the case, then how is the survivor now independently going to plan for those things? And it's really important to pull apart the ideas of support versus safety versus isolation. So we want to support survivors in really identifying what it is that they want and need for their life. And we want to bring a context of safety into that conversation. But what we don't want to end up with is that survivor feels isolated and unable to be in contact with his or her own supportive community due to the safety restrictions that we've put in place. I've worked with many survivors, particularly survivors of immigrant communities that don't want to leave the community that they're living in, and firmly believe that they will be safer moving to an apartment a couple blocks over because they'll stay within their cultural community that has the safety of their family, of their extended family, of their chosen family, of their faith community, and all of the resources that they know, rather than moving themselves and their children, clear to another town or across town to receive services in a way that we're deeming as safe. So it's really, really important to make sure that safety never encourages isolation. It's also important to think about how an abusive partner may be sabotaging the efforts of the survivor to do the things that she or he's identifying they need to do. I worked for a time in a program that was transitional housing for survivors of domestic violence that were also dealing with substance abuse. And what we would see over and over is that a survivor would get clean and because she was choosing to and was feeling really good about the progress that she was making, and then all of a sudden the abusive partner would show up at the methadone clinic and everything would sort of dissolve from there, because even if he wasn't actively trying to get her to use or offering her drugs, just his presence was enough of a trigger to make her believe that she may not deserve to be clean. When things look sideways with the survivor, it's often important to think about how the abusive partner may be playing a role, or ask the survivor how that's working and if the abusive partner is playing a role, and how you can help. I think that oftentimes once a survivor has obtained a longer-term housing option, we all sort of take a deep collective breath and feel like they're going to be safe and everything's going to be great. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. As I was saying before, oftentimes when a survivor gets safe and stable is when the abusive partner will return into her life. And that can look like everything from stalking behavior to contacting friends and family to filing some sort of off-the-wall legal case to get her back embroiled in the criminal legal system or the civil legal system. So if you're a permanent housing provider, it's important to still talk about safety and think about what safety at home looks like with children. If the survivor is financially stable and able to be independent from the abusive partner, if the survivor is working, how safety looks at his or her job, and in public settings in general. Public transportation is a really important thing to think about. Or if the survivor has a particular park that the survivor and the children go to, does the abusive partner know about that? And if so, this isn't about the survivor no longer going to that park. It's about if the abusive partner shows up, what happens? because again, it's about autonomy and dignity, and we don't want to take autonomy away from the survivor. And then also we know that because of abuse to self-medicate, many survivors end up using drugs or alcohol. We also know that many survivors use drugs and alcohol prior to being involved in an abusive relationship because of early childhood traumas. So really working from a harm reduction mentality and making sure that if survivors are continuing to use, they're using in a way that's safe, that they're interacting with folks that don't interact with their abusive partner if using together was a thing, and that they do have the resources to stop using should they so choose. Another component of domestic violence advocacy is voluntary services, and it's based on a philosophy and framework that emphasizes providing information and encouraging true choice. So it is terribly difficult for case managers, housing homeless providers, domestic violence advocates to not be invested in what a survivor is or is not choosing to do. But through the lens of voluntary services, which is an important component of a housing first philosophy, we know that it's essential that we stay in a place where we have care and we have concern, but we are offering true choice and not being invested in what choice a survivor is making. So as we were talking about before, this is harm reduction. It can be called the empowerment model. That's sort of being phased out, but the term is really less important than the underlying principles of true choice, autonomy, and dignity, that when services are provided from that context, we know that even though survivors may not be making the choices that we would make, that they're making the choices that are best for them at the time. It also allows for people to make mistakes, which I think is an important component when you're working in housing work in general, that oftentimes we see people in their first permanent housing. Or after they have been housed from living on the streets for far longer than they ever thought they might, or after living with a dealer for a long time and living in an unsafe situation, they've come into a housing program where we work, and we expect them to be able to make all the choices that are going to result in all of the correct things for their life. And what we know is that even those of us that are lucky enough to be stably housed every day don't make the correct choices every day of our lives. So working from a model of voluntary services where we're offering true choices allows for survivors and folks that are dealing with housing instability in our programs in general to come back to us and say, I don't think that was the right thing. I need to make a different choice. Because you didn't judge them, because you didn't direct them, because you didn't tell them what to do, folks are far more likely to come back to you and say, I actually need help. I don't think this is working for me. There's so much value in developing that authentic relationship with the people you're working with. And then the most important thing to look at for yourself is, where does that authentic relationship, where do the boundaries of that lie? And making sure that that's staying professional and that it's also staying uninvested from the choices that they're making. So it's a hard line to walk, and again, it's why peer support is so important. It's important in voluntary services that shelter and housing and eligibility is not contingent upon accessing support services. So that you can be in housing and you don't have to go to support group every day, or you don't have to go to treatment, or you don't have to do anything that you are not wanting or willing to do, but that you still have the right to be housed. As I was saying before, it's participant-driven and relationship-based. The model of voluntary services makes it far easier for a participant to engage in services, and it makes it far more difficult for a case manager to provide those services. But that is really the way that should look, and that we're here as the professionals, and the burden of that needs to be on us. It doesn't need to be on the person that is trying to recover from trauma and abuse and become stably housed for the first time in a long time and all these things. Like, We need to be working to make the situation as easy as possible for them, and that means letting them run the show. And knowing that we're walking alongside them and that we're bearing witness to their pain and trauma and that we believe them is essential, but not saying, and because of those things, this is what I'm telling you to do. So this is really whole person work. It's important that it includes a historical and relational context, that we are looking at not just the trauma that they may have faced now, but the trauma that historically may have occurred because of systemic oppression, and that for each situation, each person you work with, each situation is going to be different. So the next session is some scenarios, and I'm wondering if there are any more questions at this point.
Yes, there's one from Christine, and she has asked if you have any tips on working with child youth services when children are involved.
I'm sorry, working with what?
Children and youth services.
Oh, okay, yes. I have many tips. It can be really important when children and youth services are involved with a family's life to make sure that the survivor is still maintaining all of the autonomy that they can in that relationship. I think that when systems are involved like that in a family's life, it can be very easy for the survivor to sort of bow out and say, like, I've never had control over my children and now the system is involved and I'm not going to have control over my children now. And where a case manager or an advocate can really come in is offering to go to Child and Family Services meetings with the survivor and offering to role play if they have to meet with a caseworker, and offering to come to meetings with a caseworker, offering to send letters of participation to a caseworker if that's helpful, and really making sure that the survivor has what they need to sort of maintain their dignity during a time when there are other systems that are working to that maybe not be as concerned about that, you know. I think that it's you know, we're in a situation with Child and Family Services where it's essential that we comply, but we don't have to turn ourselves inside out. We don't have to become, as much as caseworkers might often want us to, we don't have to become their secret spies on the ground to find out what's really happening. It's our job to support the survivor in those moments, and we know that some of those can be the most difficult. So really just, you know, many of the things that we've already talked about, like showing up, offering to go to meetings, offering to really walk alongside them in that process. Are there any other questions?
There are none at this time.
Okay. So I have a couple scenarios that I have heard over the years, and I think we can talk through them. And then I would love if you all have some scenarios that you've dealt with in your programs recently, if you'd like to sort of ask those in the chat box, and then we can address them together. So the scenario is that there's current domestic violence going on. You're working with a family. Both parents are housed in your unit. There's children. We don't feel like we have the resources. Location isn't confidential. The survivor needs to go to a domestic violence agency, but she wants a housing program. So it's important here to talk about what your fears are as a provider. One of the things that I think is a misconception about domestic violence is that abusive partners will target anyone and everyone. So what we know for the most part is that domestic violence is a very targeted act, that it is the victimization and the continual victimization of one individual to wear down their identity and self-worth, to attempt to regain or gain more for yours. We don't often hear of situations where an abusive partner harmed others that were adjacent to the relationship. So whether that is physically adjacent, like neighbors or other people that live in the building, or whether that's family members, so people that are sociologically adjacent. What's interesting to me, though, is as I'm saying all of this, I'm thinking about all of the instances that have come up in the last few years of folks that have been either accused of or convicted of domestic violence that have also used guns to commit incredible acts of violence in communities. So even though those are the situations that we hear about, what I want to point out is those are the least likely situations to occur. They're the situations that get the most attention because they're sensationalized and because they deserve attention because they're acts of terrorism. But what we most often see is very targeted one-on-one abuse or abuse that exists between an abusive partner and a survivor and an abusive partner and their children. That's the most common thing. So the fears that folks feel are warranted. There's no way that I can say that you shouldn't be afraid because domestic violence is scary. And I have, been in court with some abusive partners who I hope I never have to see again. I have assisted survivors through visitations where, I didn't feel comfortable and I was concerned. But the most important thing is that the survivor that you're working with feels safe and comfortable. And the best ways to do that are to, offer to take them out for coffee or offer to go for a walk with them or whatever it is you need to do. Go to the park with them and their children and whatever it is you need to do to get them away from their abusive partner, to have a conversation about how they're doing and that, you're very concerned about their safety and to really, talk with the survivor and find out why she or he doesn't want to go to a domestic violence agency. Oftentimes, a survivor's biggest fear after they've gotten into housing is that they're going to lose that housing. And as I was saying before, domestic violence agencies often aren't set up with the permanent housing options that housing homeless providers are. So figuring out how to bring the domestic violence agency to the survivor is sometimes the best option. So if a survivor says that she or he isn't interested, speaking with your local domestic violence agency to find out if they could provide services on site or in another location. In domestic violence world, we call that mobile advocacy. If they're willing to be mobile and to come to the survivor rather than expecting the survivor to come to them, and see if that would make a difference. Or if they're not willing to work with the domestic violence agency because there's so much shame around even identifying that you are a survivor of domestic violence, that sometimes, again, like I said, just telling more than one person is more than a survivor wants to do. Really making sure then that you, as the provider, have the support of the domestic violence agency, or you can call me, or you can call other folks that you know in the domestic violence movement to get that support. Again, it's important to remember that safety planning is a process, not a one-time event. It's tailored to each survivor's life and daily activities. It's important, too, that if you're working with a couple, asking the survivor how they've seen power and control be used by their abusive partner, because if if they are sort of coming to a dead end with safety planning and feeling hopeless and not sure what to do, one of the great ways to sort of tease that out is to say, well, what has happened to you in the past? And if you could have done something differently, what would you have done? And then really play on that survivor's strength to be able to identify what then she or he could do in the future. It's so essential to listen to what a survivor needs, because you may have this entire conversation with the survivor and they may say, I know that it's bad, I know that it looks bad, I know that it's causing a ruckus in the community, I know the cops are called all the time, but I don't want to leave and I can't, and here are the reasons. It's your responsibility to say, I completely understand that, and I got to tell you I'm worried for you, and here are the reasons I'm worried, and I want you to know I'm here for you. But respect the survivor's choice to continue in that relationship if that's what she or he is choosing. And it's also, when you're safety planning, it's important to remember that the survivor's activities and the daily life that she or he is leading and the abuser's tactics, the tactics of power and control that we were talking about earlier, will really guide the safety planning process. So sometimes what I've had survivors do when in a safety planning process is write down their daily schedule and where they are and where they're going. Identify the places where they're most concerned, and then think about what the abusive partner has done in the past to create a scary situation for that family in that moment. So the scenario is that you know that there's domestic violence in a unit in your housing program, but they're both violent. So what do you do, and how do you know who the victim is? This really goes back to the idea that you knowing who you're working with and developing authentic relationships with the people that you serve is essential. This means authentic relationships with both the person that is surviving the relationship and the abusive partner in the relationship, if that individual is willing to let you build an authentic relationship with them, which usually isn't the case. If you have concerns that there's domestic violence going on in a unit and both people are violent, it's important that you have individual conversations with both individuals in the unit to get a better understanding of what's going on. If you're asking a person, you know, I'm hearing all sorts of noises come from your unit, I'm getting tons of complaints, it seems like you both are yelling at each other all of the time. Can you talk to me about what's going on and how that's, you know, how this is playing out for you? You can ask questions like, do you feel like you're getting your needs met in the relationship? Do you feel like this is a safe place for you to continue to live? Do you feel like you could leave if you wanted to? And asking these sorts of questions can help you identify whether or not that person is surviving. But it's not always easy to identify who is the abusive partner in a relationship and who is surviving in a relationship. You can't rely on gender lines. What we know is that women, in heterosexual relationships, women are far more abused than men. But what we do know is that men are abused, and they're the last folks to survive that are going to tell you that they're surviving. But in same-sex couples, we also know that either partner could be abusive, and that's far easier to digest than in heterosexual relationships. So my challenge is that you all apply that same idea that either person could be the abusive partner when you're talking about domestic violence with a household. I also want to point out, and this is a whole nother training in itself, but survivors often use violence to get their needs met. When I'm doing trainings on domestic violence, I have what I call the hallmark story of, or the lifetime story of a domestic violence survivor, and it's on Lifetime TV. And the survivor is, you know, everything was fine in their relationship, and they have this beautiful home, and they have 2 children, and then all of a sudden one day her husband becomes violent. He hits her once, she leaves, she goes and she meets with an attorney, she ends up falling in love with the attorney, and they live happily ever after. We know that's not the case. We know that people's lives are far messier than that, and that those sort of fairy tales don't happen. What we know is that people are tuned in and built to make sure that they survive. And that can mean using all sorts of tactics that the abusive partner has also been using to make sure that they're safe and their children are safe. Oftentimes, too, a survivor doesn't completely understand the violent tactics that they have used to survive until they are safe and stable in housing. I can't tell you the number of survivors I've worked with over the years who things were moving along well, their abusive partner was out of the picture, they were feeling far more safe and stable than they had in a long time. And because of the way trauma works and because of the way that your brain can, relax when you're feeling safer, oftentimes then is when a survivor begins to think about the things that they did. And what we know is that a survivor's use of violence is not good and it's not acceptable, but it absolutely makes sense. And so how do you work with a survivor to make sure that they understand that what they did wasn't right, but it is understandable, and what do they need to do to make amends? So like I said, you can't rely on gender or a list of behaviors. The context, intent, and effect are the most important ways to identify who is surviving and who is abusing. So in what context is the violence happening? What is the intent of the violence? And then what is the effect of the violence? So if the intent of the violence is to make one person feel less than the other, and the effect is that that is a continuing occurrence, so that person does continually feel less than the other, that's a great way to identify a pattern of power and control. It's important that you have those really, really hard conversations and assess and lean on your domestic violence provider and your community to help you have those conversations rather than screening out and evicting both individuals. Violence will continue if both individuals are evicted. I also understand that there are some situations that you can't avoid, that eviction is necessary. I have had to evict survivors before, so I know that it happens. But there are all sorts of things that you can do before you get to that point. And then, is the threat to tenants real, or is it the fact that tenants are just upset that people are being noisy and cops are being called? It's important to tease that out and to really think about your community and the community that you've created in your housing program and what's needed there, and then to support tenants and hear their concerns and also let them know that they are safe and that anywhere they live, because we know that that domestic violence doesn't just happen obviously in housing programs, it happens everywhere that you go. So making sure that they understand that the threat to them is far less, and and people also need to make choices that, like, if where they're living isn't working for them, they can be encouraged to make other arrangements. If that's moving apartments in the same complex, maybe that's a good idea. Are there any scenarios, we have about a half an hour left, I think. Are there any scenarios that you all would like to discuss today?
There isn't anything posted right now. I don't know if you want to give it maybe a few minutes for people to get a chance to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk a little bit about the resources section here. I work for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and then on our website, there's an interactive map that helps you locate the DV program in your county. I put the link to the map on there. So if you are working in Adams County, you can log on, or you can go onto our website and you can click on Adams County and you'll be able to see that the program there is Survivors, and it's located in Gettysburg, and you can reach out to them. I also want to make sure that you all know that I'm a resource to you too. So my phone number, like I said, and my email is at the end of this slide presentation, and I'm happy to help with any questions you may have. Your local DV provider is going to be the best partner you can ask for, though, and so if you need help making a connection there, I'm happy to do that also. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape is also a great resource. The Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence is listed on here because they have run the Domestic Violence Housing First project out of Washington State, and a lot of the content, also because I just moved from there to here, is from the Washington State Coalition, so I want to make sure to give them credit. The National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence are both listed here also, and some other resources that help that can help you build context for how to serve survivors.
There's still no scenarios being shared here, Maria, so if you want to continue on.
I think I have one. What types of domestic violence situations are being prioritized with the lack of domestic violence shelter space? And what are some of those high danger cases? So this is a great question. Prioritization for domestic violence shelter space can look very different from domestic violence shelter to domestic violence shelter. I think that it's often prioritized by a survivor calling and telling, being really willing to talk about the violence that is occurring in their life. What PCADV encourages domestic violence organizations to prioritize is folks that are needing to leave their home immediately and that are experiencing physical violence in a way that is a threat for them to stay in their home. So that's fairly straightforward, except that what we know is that domestic violence organizations are often the very last phone call that survivors make. I think that most of us, if we were in a situation where we needed to leave our home immediately, I can think of a list of probably 50 people I would call before I would call my local domestic violence program. And I've worked in domestic violence programs for over 15 years. So if I'm willing to say that, I think that that is pretty true universally. So unfortunately, oftentimes by the time a survivor reaches a domestic violence program because they have no other options, either a threat of violence hasn't occurred recently, or they've been staying with a family member but they need to leave, and so the violence doesn't seem, or the situation doesn't seem as urgent. So what I encourage domestic violence organizations to do when they're screening for shelter is to really look at the length of time the violence has occurred and how the survivor is feeling about continuing to maintain within that violence. Look at whether or not children are a part of the scenario, and then to look at the systemic barriers that exist for that survivor and what it's going to take for that survivor to acquire even a shelter space elsewhere. So this is really important for transgender survivors. It's important for immigrant survivors, for survivors of color, and for other folks that may not want to move into a communal living setting for whatever reason. Because what we want to make sure, again, is that when survivors do leave the situations they're in, they're leaving to a dignified place. So I think that high danger cases can be helped and supported by domestic violence emergency shelters, and they certainly are. Some of the most high danger cases that I've ever worked with, though, were folks that needed to leave, that going to a domestic violence shelter wasn't going to stop their abusive partner, that really leaving the area was the most effective thing for them to do. So that's always an option that should be presented to survivors, which requires funders to be very flexible in the way that they're allowing organizations to spend money. So part of the problem is that, you know, these domestic violence situations occur, survivors call, they get into shelter, then it's oftentimes very challenging to leave shelter. So that's actually a large piece of the problem that's causing the backlog and causing domestic violence shelters to be continually full, is that affordable housing options don't exist for survivors oftentimes after an emergency shelter stay. As I said before, once anyone is homeless, it's much harder to get housed again. And survivors have all of these barriers working against them that we've talked about today. So as the balanced state COCs, I think it's very, very important that we look at how we are really prioritizing permanent housing options for the people that are going to have the most problem finding permanent housing. That's the thing that will really free up shelter bed space to allow for emergence, middle of the night, leaving the house sort of situations to occur. Because we know that there are those, and we often know that survivors believe that they can't go anywhere, they can't get out, and so they choose to stay. And it's really our goal to make sure that survivors never have to choose between staying in an abusive home and homelessness, and so having emergency shelter space open is essential. Through my position here at PCADV, one of the things that I'm hoping to do is to implement the domestic violence housing first philosophy here as we did in Washington State. And so what that means is that PCADV will be partnering with the Balance of State COCs and other COCs in Pennsylvania to make sure that survivors have a wide variety of housing options to choose from. And when we are assuring a variety of housing options for survivors, that increases capacity within the entire system. Because we know that the majority of women and children that you all are working with are homeless due to domestic violence. So if as DV providers we help create permanent housing solutions, we're going to be creating capacity within the entire system. As Lee was saying, we've already begun to do this with partnering in the COC application, and we'll be continuing to look for different ways to do that. So if there are needs that you're seeing in your community, I would love to hear about them, and I would love to be able to come to your organizations and help create internal capacity to serve survivors better. I'm happy to do that. That's part of Housing First work. And I'm also happy to think through things with you all about what options for survivors could be used best in the Balanced State COCs. If there aren't any more questions, that's all I had today.
Great. Brendan, did anybody else submit a question?
I do not see any.
Okay, great. Maria, thank you so much. Appreciate your time this morning and all this wonderful information for everyone.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria.